So tell me about the piece that's included in Layered and Stitched.
Well, the piece in Layered and Stitched is called Fjord. And the piece was a result of a residency in the Canadian Arctic on Baffin Island in a village called Pangerton. And I was there because there was a tapestry weaving studio where Inuit women weave. And that was what drew me to the place. And they kind of took care of me during the time I was in Pangerton. And mostly I spent time out on the land, which is how I tend to work. I go to a location. I do a lot of research about the place first, reading, and if there are any museums, I go to those. And then I go out on the land and just experience the land in whatever way that I can, through collecting material or walking, photographing, drawing, in whatever way. I don't generally make work while I'm on site. I collect information. And then when I get back to the studio, that's when I produce work. And so this piece was a response to Pangerton, which is in a fjord. And that I was taken by the geological form of the fjord, which was these kind of very steep walls going down into the water. And I imagined the depths of the water and how those stone walls continued down into the quite a deep level. And often I'll find a geological form that informs my shapes and forms. And so that's where the form came from in the quilt. The other thing I work with is the intimate landscape. And so the fjord is kind of the distant landscape, what you see with your eyes. But then walking, you're walking on the tundra, which is this amazing group of plants that grows together very tightly and creates a little microclimate so they can survive. And just the feeling, I often walked barefoot if I could, if it was warm enough on the tundra. It's kind of like walking on this ancient, tiny forest. And so what you experience with your body, what you can touch, what you can see up close, tiny plants. And so there usually are two aspects to my pieces. There's the distant or the larger forms, and then the intimate details. And so that's a bit what this piece is about. So if you see this piece from a distance, you see the large U shape, that deep shape. Then if you go up close, there are lots of sort of sensual details in the stitching and the applique work. And so, I like people to be drawn in close once they see it from a distance.
When you're gathering all of this information in your research and, visually as you're experiencing the environment, how do you then distill that into this minimalist quilt aesthetic that you have?
That's the big mystery. I don't know how that happens, but I know I have to do the research. I spend time in museums. I read. I like doing all of the research about, who lives there and the patterns of settlement and, the plant forms and those things, and then the actual experience of the place. And when I come back to the studio, I couldn't tell you exactly how that all translates into the work, but I do know I couldn't do the work without that base, that base of experience of research, and it all gives me something to work off of, and it comes through in the work in some way, and it just feels like it absorbs into me.
A lot of your work has this recurring motif of the vessels, the bowl shapes, and the cup shapes. Why is that?
Well, that actually happened in one very dramatic moment. And from my studio, I can see a lake. And it's just sort of there. It's kind of one of my landmarks. It's one of the kind of anchors in my, the place where I live. I know it's there, it's in the front, and the hills in the back. And, you know, you kind of have a little stage that you live on with your sort of anchors. And one night I came out and I glanced at the lake, and the sun was setting, and it was reflecting on the lake in such a way that it looked as if it were a floating golden ellipse. And I had never seen it that way, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And just seeing the surface floating in that beautiful elliptical shape. And then as I stood there and looked at it, I realized there are hills on either side. And I thought about how they come down and they continue down in a kind of gentle way and form a bowl that's holding water. And that instant really set off a whole series of work around container shapes. And the Fjord piece is part of that, you know, looking at that kind of a different kind of a container. And with the pieces from my lake, I kind of thought about the hill and the lake and how the hills actually form the bowl shape. And then also the idea of the interior landscape and a bowl on your kitchen table. And so there's this sort of exterior landscape and an interior. And a bowl is it's a very symbolic form, I think.
What draws you to the techniques that you use?
Well, my techniques are, I have to laugh a bit because when I came into textile, I was working a lot with I made forays into trying to dye fabric and paint with dyes and sort of translating, like the materials were familiar, like you can use a paintbrush with dyes and you can use a tjanting tool to draw a resist line on. And so that I kind of gravitated to those familiar tools and tried to translate them into textile. But my first forays into dyeing, it was just terrible. I mean, the dyes washed out and they bled all over the place, and I really got frustrated with it. So when I tried discharging, which is starting with black fabric, and then I was using wax resist with paintbrushes, printing tools, and tjantings, and drawing and painting onto the black fabric of resist, and then removing the color by discharging, which resulted in black marks on a white background that actually stayed there. They stayed in place. And I was really happy with that. And I also was really happy with the graphic quality of it. I could relate it to printmaking. And so I kind of thought, okay, I just stuck with that and allowed it to develop gradually. I didn't try too many other techniques after that. I just sort of stuck with that technique and developed a vocabulary. I think when you choose a technique, it's kind of like choosing an instrument, and then you have to practice the scales until you are fluid and articulate, and it's almost second nature. And so then you can use it as an expressive medium. And so I think just sticking with the one technique. And of course, it's changed over time, but it's changed very gradually and organically. And it's served me well. I like working with that kind of a black and white graphic. And then stitching came into my work later, actually. And I enjoy seeing what thread will do. I mean, again, how is a stitch different than a drawn or painted mark? And how can you bring the kind of gesture that you can get, say, with a painted mark, you can move your entire arm and make a big slash of paint. How can you get that kind of energy or gesture into a stitch or into thread? And one of the things I explored with thread is, what kind of marks can thread make and how can you create those? So sometimes I would just say, put the fabric on the floor and throw the thread and let it just fall randomly and continue to throw it and throw it. So then you become a kind of editor that, you set it up so that you're not in control, but you're still in control because you can choose the mark or the line that comes out that you're excited by. And so it's a way of using thread is to make a drawing or a drawn line. Another thing with thread is it reacts to gravity. And so if you pick thread up on two ends, that's how I form my lakes and my fjords. And if you pick the thread up and you move your hands in and out, the thread changes shape. I've forgotten what that's called, has a name, has a mathematical name. And those are beautiful curves that you can form with thread using gravity.
Would you talk a little bit about where you live and how it inspires your work?
I live in rural Ontario. I moved here in 1972 from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with a group of fellow art students. We had all just graduated from art school and wanted to get our art practices started. And we had no idea where we were going. We landed in this what was a very conservative farming area. And I've stayed here and it's changed considerably since then. But I love living here. And moving from an urban center to a rural area, I became aware of the farming patterns, the grid form that everyone in North America lives on. We live on this kind of stage that is based on a grid, and everything has built up, all the patterns of settlement have built up around that idea of the grid. So we drive the grid, we walk the grid, our architecture adheres to the grid. And so it's a part of our culture. And I started to notice that first through the beautiful farming patterns and the division of land. And when I was doing a research project at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto and the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Hull, Quebec, studying their quilt collections, because I really wanted to learn as much about quilts and that tradition as I could. And I decided to take 2 years and just read and look at quilt collections and study them and see what I was drawn to. And in studying the patterns, like I was taken by the 4-patch, which is really the oldest quilt configuration, the simplest, just simply 4 squares. And for me, it related to the 4 squares of land that I live on. I live on 4 squares of land, divided by 2 tree lines. And so it made me think of the land and the grid. And so I did a series of works, quilts. The series was called Field Notes. And the first piece I made was called 4-patch, hay, wheat, rye, barley. So I wanted to connect the textile tradition of quilt making to the land in some way. So it's really very personal. I mean, the series of the bowls and lakes came directly from the lake in front of my house. So I really draw directly from the land and where I live. And when I go out to other places that are unfamiliar territory, I take some of those things with me and they contrast. They give me contrast to other places.
What excites you about making art quilts?
I think what excites me about the area of quilt making is the tradition, working out of a tradition that was women's art and women's work. When I went to art school, I know things are different now, but when I went to art school, it was very white, European, male oriented. So the art history we learned was European, and there were very few women presented. You know, there were the few women artists, painters, and very few, and certainly nothing that would acknowledge the work that women did within a domestic realm as art. And so I think studying those traditions has been very important for me. Studying the tradition of quilt making, looking at those quilts, and studying traditions such as sashiko, which is a Japanese art form that evolved out of mending and repair practices. And it evolved, like quilt making, it evolved into something that where the patterns had names, the stitched patterns have names. But originally it was really to keep fabric going, to keep it going as it wore out. And then Indian kantha embroidery. I worked in India on a research grant studying kantha stitching. And again, that was originally to reuse fabric, reuse old saris and layer them and stitch them together. But it became women's form of expression. They took it from there and made it into something else. And so those textile art forms inspire me and have informed my work.
Your work seems very process-based, and you said that it can be a way of marking the passage of time. Would you please talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it is very process-based. And I do a lot of stitching, which is a slow process. And I always think of the stitches not only as marks, but as marking time. So if you think of a stitch as a second, and of a second of your time, so you're imbuing this cloth with your time. You're putting your time, making it visible in this piece of textile. And so I like that idea, like thinking about that, and it makes me feel like you can take the time a piece needs to be completed. You know, I don't worry about how long it takes. It just takes whatever time it needs to be finished. And another idea about time, when you think about quilt making, when I was studying the traditional quilts, I noticed that the quilts that I was drawn to, the historic quilts, were quilts that came with, were made with fabric that came with a previous history. So they were made from pieces of old homespun that might have been a blanket, or might have been a coat, or might have been, they were something else previous. And they bring that history and those lives to the next thing that they become. And I like that with textile, and like other materials like metal and clay. Textile wears out and breaks down. And so many of these traditions have evolved out of reuse, or, you know, reconstructing into something new. And I like that idea that a textile can continuously build a sense of lives lived, or a sense of history as it becomes something else. And, yeah, it was a great thing working in those museums, because I looked through quilt after quilt, and as I was looking, not the real quilts, pictures of them, I had to select the quilts I would get to look at. So I had to really feel through the pictures what I was drawn to. And so I would look at them, and I wasn't aware of it until I did that exercise. And I said, okay, what is it about this quilt that's drawing me in? And what is it about this quilt? Oh, they're both made of fabrics that have had a previous history or a previous use. And that was a wonderful part of that residency too.
How did you develop your personal style?
Well, I think partly by, in the beginning, sticking to one process. I started with using wax resist, using tjanting tools to draw with and printing blocks and using the discharge process. And I worked with that for many years, developing a vocabulary of marks and a personal vocabulary that I felt like I could speak with. It became kind of second nature. I felt fluid with it. And, you know, I think that it helped me to sort of stay with one particular technique and allow things to kind of poke into it. You know, like I have things come along and change it. And like at one point, I wanted to see how I could make a darker background with a thin line, how I could get thin white lines. And I thought about how I could do that. And I tried doing it by covering the whole fabric with hot wax and scoring into it, like the same way you would make a print, like making a print plate, drawing into it. But the wax was too hard and it really didn't work. And then I thought about the kind of liquid wax that ceramic artists use on their pots to form a resist. And I wondered if that would work. And so that led me to doing a whole series of works. I got potter's wax and I'd stretch the fabric and using a roller, paint roller, roll layers of the liquid wax on. And it was much softer. And I could score into it, draw into it with, I had various tools that I collected that I could make different marks. And then the bleach discharge agent would seep down into those lines and give me thin drawn white lines. And so it kind of evolved and changed over time. And right now I don't use wax anymore and I don't use bleach anymore. I eliminated that because it's really not very good for the environment. And I, at one point, decided to find a different way. Also, I wanted to work in a larger scale with fine marks. And there was no way I could draw by hand with wax every single tiny line for a 10-foot piece. And I came around to the idea of drawing on paper my marks and then making a photo silk screen and silk screening those marks onto the fabric. So that's how I've been working lately, is silk screening my background patterns onto the fabric. And there was kind of a transition point where I was silk screening onto the black fabric and still discharging it, which worked beautifully and I love the results. But again, I wanted to get rid of the bleach. So it's evolved in that way gradually.
What is the best piece of advice you have ever been given as an artist?
This wasn't given to me directly by an artist, but it's a quote that has meant a huge amount to me over the years. And it's from George O'Keeffe. And the quote is something like, "I've been terrified every moment of my life, but I've never let it stop me from doing anything I wanted to do." And I carry that in my head because I don't think I'm a very brave or courageous person, but I want to go into these remote places and I want to do these things. And it's a little bit scary, but then I like thinking of that quote, that you can't let those things stop you. You just have to go for it and forget your parents telling you to be careful, you know, and just get on with your life and doing what you want to do.